Now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this morning, Annelise K. Madsen, the Gilda and Henry Buchbinder Curator, Arts of the Americas with the Art Institute of Chicago. She joined the Art Institute of Chicago in 2011, and she specializes in U.S. painting, sculpture, and visual culture. She's particularly interested in elevating historical women artists, studying artworks in the permanent collection, stewarding acquisitions, developing exhibitions and programming, and presenting new research to recover and revalue the contributions and stories of female makers. The current exhibition project, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, is the subject of today's conversation, but I'll go ahead and mention a few other projects that Annelise is working on. So in addition to My New Yorks, Madsen is currently preparing an exhibition on Mary Cassatt. She curated and authored John Singer Sargent and Chicago's Gilded Age in 2018, and has co-curated and contributed to several other exhibitions and publications at the Art Institute. Additionally, she's contributed essays to such publications as Women Building History, Public Art in the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in 2011, American Art, and Winterthur Portfolio. Madsen holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University and a BA from Washington University in St. Louis. So again, thank you so much for being here, Annelise. I will go ahead and turn things over to you, and we'll come back at the end for Q&A.
Oh, and while I try to do two things at once, I'll share my screen. I hope you see slides now. And let me first extend my thanks to Molly Baker and the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum for the invitation to speak today. I'm really delighted to be here. Again, I'm Annelise Madsen. I'm co-curator of the exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, along with my colleague at the Art Institute, Sarah Kelly Oler. This project was many years in the making, and it is such a joy to finally be at this moment when our own efforts and those of so many great colleagues across the museum and beyond have coalesced in this singular presentation on O'Keeffe at New York City. The Art Institute has not mounted a solo exhibition on the artist since 1988, 2 years after her death. And so we are indeed enjoying celebrating O'Keeffe all summer long in our galleries. A note that the exhibition is on view in Chicago just a little bit longer through September 22nd. It will then travel to the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, presented there from October 25th through February 16th of next year. Just trying to, there we go, forward slides. When you think of Georgia O'Keeffe, what first comes to your mind's eye? Flowers, still lives, abstractions, desert landscapes, animal bones, or perhaps clouds? Do you have a ready image of New York when you think of the artist, such as this work in the collection of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, a monumental untitled painting dating to the 1970s that reprises a 1926 painting called City Night? Positioned at street level, we as viewers gaze sharply upward at giant monoliths, skyscrapers abstracted by O'Keeffe into bold, angular forms stretching from the bottom to the top of the canvas. Radiating areas of white denote the moon and stars in the evening sky, represented by a brilliant blue that cuts through the composition. This is very likely the last New York picture undertaken by O'Keeffe, painted about 50 years after she first took on the city as subject, and almost 3 decades after she moved permanently from New York to New Mexico. Although the intensity of her engagement with the subject matter dates to the 1920s into the 1930s, the project of rendering the urban landscape stuck with her, and O'Keeffe returned to it once more late in life in this dramatic work. O'Keeffe was a New Yorker for decades. She lived in the city on multiple occasions, covering much of her career. As a longtime city dweller, she took up the challenge of painting Manhattan, creating innovative works, including this one, the Shelton with Sunspots, New York, one of the artist's great canvases, part of the permanent collection here at the Art Institute, and truly the inspiration for this exhibition. Beginning in 1924, O'Keeffe and her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, lived in the Shelton Hotel, a novel residential skyscraper located on Lexington Avenue between 48th and 49th Streets. The experience of living high above the city motivated O'Keeffe tremendously, and she pushed her art in new directions. While celebrated for her images of flowers and southwestern landscapes, O'Keeffe's city subjects as a body of work have received relatively little attention. This exhibition at the Art Institute is the first to seriously examine the artist's paintings, drawings, and pastels of the built environment, while also situating them within the diverse context of other compositions of the early 1920s, or of the 1920s and early 1930s. These years represent a pivotal moment of experimentation as she developed her modernist vision and seized her place in the art world. She intensively explored New York as subject matter, resulting in powerful personal works that capture both the geometries and sensations of a changing urban setting. Yet this aesthetic attention to the city around her was never O'Keeffe's singular focus. Her pursuit in the 1920s were ambitious and wide-ranging, from compositions inspired by Manhattan to formal abstractions untethered to place, still lifes, landscapes, and natural abstractions composed at Lake George in upstate New York, and works featuring bones, crosses, adobe structures, and the arid landscapes of the Southwest, where from 1929 onward, O'Keeffe painted each summer. And so here in the exhibition, we gathered together for the first time a major constellation of O'Keeffe's city pictures, works that she called My New Yorks, and equally important, present them in relation to the great variety of aesthetic exploration that characterized her mode of making during this crucial decade. In a letter to an art critic in 1925, O'Keeffe declared, quote, "My New Yorks would turn the world over," unquote. She had big expectations for her New York canvases, and this exhibition aims to grant them their due attention as bold visual statements, as well as contextualize them within this breakout moment in O'Keeffe's career. Born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin in 1887, O'Keeffe spent her early decades in the Midwest and on the East Coast, studying at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 1905 to 6, and the following year at the Art Students League in Manhattan. Over the next decade, she threw herself into new experiences, particularly as an art teacher, and traveled the country in the process, based at times in New York, Virginia, South Carolina, and Texas. The ground shifted for O'Keeffe in 1916, when the influential gallerist and photographer Alfred Stieglitz learned of her work and first exhibited some of her drawings in New York. The event marked the beginning of a whirl of correspondence between them and what would become an enduring relationship. Now, this photograph of the couple was taken many years later. In 1918, Stieglitz convinced O'Keeffe to leave her teaching post in Texas and move to New York City to focus on her art making. The two soon lived together, O'Keeffe leaving his wife and family in the process. They married in 1924. And for the better part of 3 decades, they were an art world power couple, advancing their own careers while also playing important roles in each other's professional lives, and doing so all the while navigating the dynamics of their personal relationship. 1918 thus marks a moment of reorientation in O'Keeffe's career, with New York City becoming an important locus of activity. After the vast distances she had trekked from South Carolina to the Midwest to West Texas, O'Keeffe settled into a new rhythm with Stieglitz. From late fall through spring, they lived in Manhattan. Then summer and early autumn were spent in upstate New York at Lake George with Stieglitz's extended family. O'Keeffe took occasional trips to paint elsewhere, but this back and forth between urban and rural New York would persist until 1929, when O'Keeffe added New Mexico to her seasonal itinerary. In 1926, O'Keeffe stated, quote, "One can't paint New York as it is, but rather as it is felt," unquote. Her approach to the material world around her was not one of transcription, but one of translation. The artist was not intent on documenting what she saw detail by detail. Instead, she aimed to translate her own lived experiences and sensations into paint. She did so from her apartment, high up in the Shelton, gazing down at the city below, and conversely from the street, she directed her eyes back upward. And here is one such street level view of the Radiator Building. Her desire to paint New York in the 1920s, as O'Keeffe characterized it decades later, was met with resistance. She wrote, quote, "I had never lived up so high before and was so excited that I began talking about trying to paint New York. Of course, I was told that it was an impossible idea. Even the men hadn't done too well with it," unquote. O'Keeffe faced the challenge head on, navigating all the while the gendered interpretations steadfastly imposed on her work by critics, artistic peers, and the public alike. From early on in her career, O'Keeffe's paintings and drawings captivated audiences, garnering press attention and praise. Yet underlying much of this critical acclaim was an assumption that because she was a woman, her artworks necessarily expressed something essentially feminine, tethered to her emotions and even her physical nature as a woman. O'Keeffe strongly disagreed. Her ambition to tackle New York as subject matter, besting the men, can be seen as one of her strategies in the 1920s to move beyond these limits. I show you here a photograph of O'Keeffe taken by Stieglitz in 1918, shortly after her move to New York, when she was on the cusp of launching her career. Stieglitz would end up taking more than 300 photographs of her, comprising a comprehensive portrait that he exhibited in 1921. The set features a variety of depictions of the artist, clothed and nude, ranging from isolated parts of her body to full-length views. In this photograph, which is in the exhibition, O'Keeffe poses in front of one of her own works. And so we can more readily discern O'Keeffe as maker, as an artistic force within the frame. Yet overall, the series complicated things for O'Keeffe. Stieglitz's intensive gaze contributed to sexualized readings of her work again and again on the part of critics. In the early 1920s, before she dug into the new material of New York, O'Keeffe honed in on compositions that landed firmly on the representational end of the aesthetic spectrum. Instead of abstractions, which she could likewise execute boldly and fluidly, O'Keeffe chose to exhibit a large selection of still lives and studies of nature: leaves, fruits, vegetables, flowers, trees, and more. In a 1924 letter, O'Keeffe made clear her intentions. She wrote, quote, "My work this year is very much on the ground. There will only be 2 abstract things, or 3 at most. All the rest is objective as I can make it. I suppose the reason I got down to an effort to be objective is I don't like the interpretation of my other things," unquote. By the following year, 1925, O'Keeffe had executed her first cityscape, shown here, New York Street with Moon. A monumental form rises at center, a smooth, simplified mass based upon the Hotel Chatham, a 13-story structure that then stood on Vanderbilt Avenue. Other towering forms lean into the space, revealing a play of what she called sky shapes beyond, illuminated by a street lamp, stoplight, and the moon. It is a dramatic opening statement by O'Keeffe. The current exhibition begins with this painting, which is hung alongside a number of others undertaken between 1923 and 1925. In this first gallery, the works installed adjacent to New York Street with Moon were all part of a group show held at Stieglitz's gallery in 1925 called Seven Americans. O'Keeffe continued to produce paintings along objective lines, a means to push back at the critics, as she had explained, but she also featured dazzling abstractions. And here are two works among that great variety: From the Lake Number 1 at left and The Chestnut Tree Gray at right. Now, in placing New York Street with Moon in the context of the works from the 1925 exhibition, we are, in a sense, reimagining the show that O'Keeffe herself intended. As it turned out, although ready for the exhibition, her New York painting did not go on view that year. Stieglitz, most likely, was the one who said no, thus undoing O'Keeffe's plans. Decades later, she recounted what happened. She stated, quote, "The men decided they didn't want me to paint New York. They wouldn't let me hang the picture. They told me to leave New York to the men. I was furious," unquote. O'Keeffe, in the end, had the last word. She included New York Street with Moon in her solo exhibition the following year at Stieglitz's gallery, and as O'Keeffe later stated matter-of-factly, quote, "It sold on the very first day of the show. The very first picture sold. From then on, they let me paint New York," unquote. Her urban canvases thereafter developed in a variety of directions, and this is the most abstract among the group. O'Keeffe called it New York Night, Madison Avenue. With its intersecting lines and softly shaded planes, the painting is not initially recognizable as one of the artist's New Yorks. Yet the title opens up this association. O'Keeffe articulated a vision of the underlying geometries of city streets when viewed from above. The streak of yellow extending from center to upper right suggests headlights for moving vehicles or street lamps illuminating the way. O'Keeffe moved easily between representation and abstraction. She was never simply working in one mode at a time. Instead, she explored numerous subjects and aesthetic vocabularies concurrently. The motivating force behind such curiosity and dexterity was her own lived experience. O'Keeffe's art making remained firmly rooted in the world around her. Take, for example, these works, again at left, New York Night, Madison Avenue, at center, Abstraction Blue, and at right, Dark Iris Number 1. O'Keeffe exhibited all three paintings at her 1928 exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery. Together, they demonstrate the artist's incredible command of artistic vocabularies, a New York that and its references to the city. The striking Abstraction Blue is a vivid formal exploration of the color, evoking flowers, vegetal forms, and even music, yet giving no indication of its subject matter or physical point of departure. And Dark Iris, the most representational, presents an elongated view of the flower brought dramatically to the front of the picture plane. O'Keeffe's deep engagement with New York as subject matter began with the Shelton Hotel. Her encounter with the skyscraper was personal, enduring, and generative. The Shelton was the first of its kind in New York, allowing residential living above the 11th floor. It must have been a revelation to the senses when she and Stieglitz moved into the building in November of 1924. The architect, Arthur Lewis Harmon, designed innovative setbacks at the 16th and 22nd floors, which allowed more light to descend into the street canyons below, created multiple rooftop terraces, and granted panoramic views to the apartments. The Shelton offered plentiful amenities for guests. This was high-rise living. This high-rise living was a new kind of city living, and certainly a privileged one. The Shelton had opened in late 1923 as a residential hotel for men, but the policy was revised the following October and the Shelton's doors were open to women. And so O'Keeffe became one of the building's earliest female residents when she moved in just a month later. Here are advertisements for the new Shelton that appeared in an art journal called International Studio in early 1925, calling out in particular the advantages of the space for a painter like O'Keeffe. One of the ads states, quote, "It is an ideal place for artists and artistic people to live for a day or for a year," unquote. Short-term or temporary living was the typical state of affairs for O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. The couple's lifestyle was marked by seasonal moves. Winters were spent in Manhattan. As summer approached, they packed up their belongings, vacated their living quarters, and headed upstate. Sometime during the fall, they moved back to the city, and then the pattern repeated. Their first stay at the Shelton in late 1924 did not follow this pattern, however. They resided there for only a month while they awaited the completion of renovations of another apartment building, that one a 4-story brownstone on 58th Street. And so, after a taste of living high above the city, they quickly found themselves down near the bustle of street level again in December of 1924. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe felt stretched by the cost of the Shelton and didn't initially pursue it as something long-term. Yet when they headed to Lake George the following summer, they were not able to secure the 58th Street apartment for the fall. And so plans took shape for a move back to the Shelton Hotel, which would become their urban home base for the next decade. In December 1925, when the couple was settling into their first long seasonal stay, Stieglitz wrote to a friend, quote, "New York is madder than ever, the pace ever increasing. But Georgia and I somehow don't seem to be of New York, nor of anywhere. We live high up in the Shelton Hotel. We feel as if we were out at mid-ocean. All is so quiet except the wind." O'Keeffe executed a number of exterior views of her skyscraper home, including a painting that she ranked among her best, the Shelton with Sunspots, New York. The origin of this canvas was rooted in a particular experience. O'Keeffe recalled, quote, "I went out one morning to look at the Shelton Hotel, and there was the optical illusion of a bite out of one side of the tower made by the sun, with sunspots against the building and against the sky," unquote. Here, within New York's monumental urban environment, the artist revealed nature's enduring power. We don't know how many Shelton's works O'Keeffe created in total, but here are the 3 known paintings. Along with the Shelton with Sunspots, there is Shelton Hotel New York #1 at left, and the Shelton at Night at right, which fortunately was photographed prior to O'Keeffe's destruction of the work. These 3 compositions demonstrate an ambition to transform the structure with her brush in markedly different ways. In distinction to the organic inflections in the Art Institute's painting, the work at left emphasizes the geometric plays of form inspired by the skyscrapers repeating windows and multiple setbacks. The Shelton at Night appears to be a study of light, the artificial glow of the streetlight, the high-rises illuminated windows, and the natural light of the moon and sky. In addition to making the Shelton Hotel the subject of her pictures, O'Keeffe focused on elevated views experienced from the building herself, particularly views looking out her apartment windows. Over the years, she resided on various floors. In the fall of 1927, she and Stieglitz moved into their favorite apartment, apartment number 3003 on the 30th floor, where they returned year after year. This unit was located on the eastern side of the building, affording views east, as well as north and south. A journalist in 1928 noted its impressive sightlines, quote, "It seemed all windows. windows overlooking housetops, steel framework, chimneys, windows to the east through which the panorama of the river and the bridge came flooding, unquote. For several years, beginning in 1926, O'Keeffe worked on a series of East River pictures in oil and pastel. The compositions hone in on the eastern edge of Midtown Manhattan, activity along the water, and the industrial landscape of Queens beyond. And this is the largest of them, entitled East River, from the 30th story of the Shelton Hotel, painted in 1928. Here, O'Keeffe portrayed the crisp sunlight of springtime. As a whole, the works revealed changing seasons, sunny and overcast skies, and powerful visions of the city in abstracted form. A number of the works have similar proportions, such as these three, but then within the space of each canvas, O'Keeffe pursued distinctive visions of the city. At left, the view of the East River is atmospheric and suggestive, highlighted by the silhouetted skyline and hazy vista beyond. In the East River picture at center, O'Keeffe captured the cold, raw sensations of a winter's day, employing visibly thick brushwork for the snowy rooftops. At right, a brighter daylight characterizes the scene, combined with the steam and smoke of the industrial landscape. This elevated vista was something both O'Keeffe and her husband Stieglitz lived with. It defined their daily surroundings in the Shelton. And as each artist pursued their work in the late 1920s, they explored their view from the window. Stieglitz did so through his preferred medium, photography. He too framed the East River, notably in the work at left. This horizontal photograph captures an expansive atmospheric view of the urban setting. In the vertical print at right, by contrast, he showcased the geometric play of a more closely cropped, abstracted cityscape. This is a standout work among O'Keeffe's East River series, a radiant pastel entitled Pink Dish and Green Leaves. Here, she attempted a view from her apartment window, unlike any other. This is the only East River composition to visualize a portion of the artist's domestic space in the Shelton, just the littlest amount, the windowsill, but something that we don't see in any other work. The work is at once a luminous still life and a cityscape with an expansive industrial vista beyond the glass compote and windowsill. O'Keeffe was an experimenter, and when she honed in on the East River as subject, she was not satisfied by just doing it one way. In undertaking the subject in series, executed over several years, she spent time with the material and took her explorations towards different ends. This, for example, is the only vertical work among O'Keeffe's East River compositions. Like the windowsill view, the painting is distinctive, here for its stylized forms and vibrant palette. From the perspective of her apartment window, O'Keeffe portrayed a radiating sun above with flares of sunspots around it, evoking the intensity of the visual experience. O'Keeffe dramatically transformed the view, achieving quite viscerally, as she put it, New York as it is felt. She experienced the city from up high, but she likewise did so from on the ground. Always one to take long walks, O'Keeffe exited the Shelton and moved through her neighborhood on foot. Her street-level views of Midtown must have taken shape during these outings, including recognizable skyscrapers such as the newly built Radiator Building at left, as well as unknown structures and locales captured in compositions of heightened abstraction, as in City Night at right. And this is the 1926 painting that the 1970s painting in the George O'Keeffe Museum's collection is based on. It is important to note that New York in these years was not uniformly developed. And so as O'Keeffe assumed the role as pedestrian, she did not encounter an uninterrupted wall of buildings block by block. Rather, her movements at street level revealed great distinctions of height among structures, as well as gaps in the skyline. There were construction projects underway, open lots, and older low-rise buildings in the mix. New vistas and unexpected relationships between forms unveiled themselves as she walked the city. In her painting of the Radiator Building, for instance, O'Keeffe captured a distance view of the structure from street level, thanks to the adjacent green space of Bryant Park, which allowed for an unobstructed sightline. The Radiator Building's unusual black cladding and nighttime illumination would have made for a dramatic encounter on an evening walk, and O'Keeffe captured that sensation in the painting through her particular aesthetic sensibilities. As in the city, O'Keeffe took solitary walks wherever she found herself. During these outings, she liked to find and collect handheld objects to take back to her studio: leaves, flowers, shells, rocks, bones, and more. This great variety of material inspired an equally broad and impressive range of work. In the same years that she produced her New Yorks, O'Keeffe continually explored still lives, landscapes, and an array of natural abstractions. Like the East River pictures, she pursued many of these handheld things in series. A flower or shell, for instance, could be the point of departure for repeated investigation. At left, the painting with a very long title, Ballet Skirt or Electric Light, from the white rose motif, represents one episode of a serial investigation of a white rose, here pared down and highly abstracted. And at right is the glowing pastel, slightly opened clamshell. O'Keeffe embraced this minuscule object and celebrated it truly, communicating in turn the something grand and enduring. At her annual exhibitions at Stieglitz's gallery, O'Keeffe convincingly demonstrated the variety and depth of her production with a wide-ranging checklist. The artist's 1927 exhibition was exemplary of this approach. Notably, the works on display that year included a critical mass of O'Keeffe's New Yorks for the first time. Alongside East River pictures, views of the Shelton, and street-level compositions like City Night, she hung paintings of irises and other blooms, found objects like a shell in series, including the work at Right, Shell and Old Shingle 6, trees and barns and landscapes, as well as formal abstractions. This was a turning point in O'Keeffe's career, to be sure. Her pictures began to sell for important sums, and museums made their first acquisitions. Decades later, O'Keeffe linked the period to her financial independence, stating, quote, "I've made my living selling my paintings since 1927, unquote. O'Keeffe demonstrated tremendous dexterity when it came to scale. She could transform one thing into something else, such as a white rose into a ballet skirt or electric light. She likewise reconceived how we see objects in the world, taking flowers from minuscule to magnified. Years later, O'Keeffe connected this scaling up of flowers with the changes to her New York environment. She said of her flower pictures, quote, "I'll make them big, like the huge buildings going up. People will be startled. They'll have to look at them." And they did, unquote. Manipulations of scale likewise worked in the other direction. She contained vast landscapes and cityscapes within her easel-size canvases. In a 1946 interview, O'Keeffe told the story of a gallery visitor who asked, quote, why do you paint flowers so large?" unquote. She in turn replied, quote, "I pointed to a picture of the East River and said, you'd never ask me why I make the East River so small," unquote. Flowers and New Yorks were part and parcel of the same aesthetic project. She labored on one subject in view of the other. In 1929, after a string of gallery shows featuring New York subjects among this great variety of work, O'Keeffe set out on a new adventure, heading to New Mexico for a summer of painting. She did not leave New York completely in the rear view. Instead, her explorations of high-rise living and walks around Manhattan stayed with her as she engaged with the distinct landscapes and objects of the Southwest. And after an invigorating stay, she returned to New York in the fall. Here are two examples of the work she painted that first summer in the Southwest. At left, Dead Tree, Bear Lake House, and at right, Rancho's Church number 3. The tree, with its silvery, twisted form rising through the center of the composition, relates formally to O'Keeffe's street-level views of towering skyscrapers. And in the work at right, she honed in on a sliver of a view of the 18th century Spanish colonial mission church. This was architecture of a different kind than the high-rise buildings of New York. O'Keeffe explored the monumental adobe structure with fresh eyes, abstracting its forms by flattening a detail of the church against the intense blue sky. At Stieglitz's New York Gallery the following year, O'Keeffe mounted an exhibition entitled 27 Paintings, New Mexico, New York, Lake George. And you can see here in this installation view that she hung one of her great skyscraper pictures, New York Night, alongside two Southwestern works after a walk back at Mabel's and Black Cross, New Mexico, bringing her varied aesthetic explorations into dialogue. And in the present exhibition, you can see these three paintings together in the galleries: an evening vista across the illuminated skyline of a bustling city, the monumental form of a rising boulder against a vivid, abstracted background, and the intense presence of a black cross pulled to the front of the picture plane with a glowing landscape beyond. O'Keeffe intended for her audiences to encounter such works within the space of a single exhibition, prompting visitors then and now to discern formal harmonies among the set and to take in the expansive range across subject and location that O'Keeffe captured so boldly with her brush. Cow's Skull with Calico Roses, painted in 1931, represents another of the artist's newfound pursuits. That year, she told a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, quote, "Bones and flowers run together in my mind when I think of the desert," unquote. As was her habit to seek out handheld objects wherever she was, the Southwest presented something entirely different in this respect: animal bones. O'Keeffe was drawn to skulls and other skeletal fragments, collecting them on outings during her summers there. And then she did something rather amazing. She shipped barrels and boxes of bones back east. In July 1931, O'Keeffe wrote to Stieglitz, who was then at Lake George, quote, "Don't open my packages when they come. There's nothing in there that would interest you. I'm sending a barrel and 2 packages aside from my box. Nothing but trash, I suppose, but it is trash I seem to think I want," unquote. As the Herald Tribune later reported, this unusual cargo soon made its way to the Shelton Hotel when the couple returned there in the fall. O'Keeffe had brought a part of the Southwest back with her to New York. And so it's really interesting to think of Cow's Skull with Calico Roses as a New York picture. Bleached animal bones and the fabric or paper flowers that she had encountered at grave sites in New Mexico, these materials were in her Shelton apartment. So with panoramic views of the East River around her, O'Keeffe may well have labored on this desert-like painting. And indeed, the Southwest's presence in New York for O'Keeffe comes through in a series of photographs taken in 1936 by Carl Van Vechten. O'Keeffe and Stieglitz had recently moved to another high-rise in Midtown, located on 54th Street near the East River. The artist poses on the building's rooftop terrace. At right, she's against a fence with a crop view of the cityscape behind her. And at left, she stands against the terrace's brick facade with one of the skulls she had collected mounted on the wall. The artist's engagement with bones as artistic material, excuse me, continued to hold the attention of the press. In 1938, for instance, Life magazine published a feature on O'Keeffe. My apologies. On O'Keeffe, including photographs of her in New Mexico handling a carcass and bones, as well as in New York. And you can see one at her apartment window where she's surrounded by paintbrushes and holding a skull. And the second there by Van out on the terrace. While O'Keeffe brought her lessons of painting New York to the Southwest, she also, in very tangible ways, brought the Southwest back to the city. This large-scale painting, entitled Manhattan, likewise demonstrates how O'Keeffe readily made connections across subject matter and site. She My apologies as I try to get through this cough. She executed an expansive array of flat geometric skyscrapers. Formally, the work feels cubist in spirit and distinct from our other city abstractions. We see those cloth or paper flowers from the Southwest floating atop the urban landscape. It is an unexpected element, but one that seems in keeping with O'Keeffe's enduring interest in working concurrently in one aesthetic mode at a time. Subject matter, vocabulary, locale, and scale were variables that the artist juggled, flexed, and combined to wondrously varied effect. The mid-1920s into the early 1930s mark O'Keeffe's most intensive period of experimentation on her New Yorks. But in subsequent years, to render the city as her own did not disappear entirely. In 1949, for instance, the artist turned her attention to one of the city's iconic structures, the Brooklyn Bridge. The composition at left is full of drama and movement, invoking the experience of walking across the bridge while looking upward. The year 1949 was a transitional one for O'Keeffe as she moved permanently from New York to New Mexico, thus ending her seasonal home base in the city. But after that, she did return periodically for visits as she maintained connections in the art world in New York. Here, in the photograph taken about 1960, she captured a view out the window where she was staying, and you see the room's gauzy curtain at upper left, with the Chrysler Building rising above the skyline beyond. O'Keeffe picked up a camera later in her career, using it as a tool for thinking and working through compositional questions. The current exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, gives due attention to the artist's fascinating visions of Manhattan. These bold and varied compositions capture the city, as O'Keeffe herself put it, as it is felt. Equally important, the exhibition presents her New Yorks in context amid the great variety of aesthetic experimentation that O'Keeffe relentlessly pursued in these years. And to conclude, I offer O'Keeffe's characterization of New York as an aesthetic project that kept her thinking well beyond her time as a resident there. In 1976, nearly concurrent with her untitled painting at Wright, she wrote, quote, when you live up high, the snow and rain go down and away from you instead of coming toward you from above. I was never able to do anything with that. There were many other things I meant to paint. I still see them when I am in the big city, unquote. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annalise. That was just terrific. And for those of you who are able to visit the exhibition in person, I believe it's up through September 22nd. Is that the case?
Yep, that's right. We're winding down.
Great. So be sure to visit or before it also travels on to its next destination. I was just telling Annalisa that one of our colleagues in the education department just saw the exhibition a few days ago and just talked about how incredible it was. And so hopefully you'll be able to visit. We did have a question in the chat about whether there is an exhibition catalog, which there is, and I posted that link to be able to purchase that through the Art Institute of Chicago's website. So that's an option too, if you're not able to visit in person. So for now though, let us walk through some of the other Q&A chat questions we have. Let's start with Ryan. Ryan asks, on Annalisa, can you tell us about assembling the show? How many museums and donors did you deal with? How long did it, I know you mentioned it took many, many years for planning, but could you tell us a little bit about the process for putting this together?
Sure, it was more than 5 years in the making. COVID had a little bit to do with that, but most of these projects are, it's not uncommon for an exhibition project to be 3 or 4 years easily in the making. But there was a lot of archival research that my colleague Sarah and I wanted to do as part of this, to really understand when O'Keeffe and Stieglitz are living in the Shelton, try to figure out where they are at what moments. And one of the great finds for us, scholarly finds there, was to realize that O'Keeffe and Stieglitz had been in the Shelton as early as November of 1924, which is a full year earlier than had previously been thought. My apologies. Yeah, so the exhibition was, a labor of love over a long period of time, and many lenders involved, including generous loans from the O'Keeffe Museum, lots of institutional loans, as well as some private collections.
Great, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about the behind the scenes work there. Another question, which I think we hear every so often about Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings. Dory wants to know why did Georgia O'Keeffe destroy that painting that you included in your presentation that has a photograph? Can you talk a little bit about maybe why that might have happened?
Oh, if we could only know why. But O'Keeffe liked the picture enough, or was satisfied enough with the Shelton at night, that she exhibited it once or maybe twice. There were a number of Sheltons exhibited. We know that there were at least 4, because 4 Sheltons were in the 1927 exhibition. There was one in the 26 show. We don't know a ton about that show. In any case, there were a number of them. So the Shelton at night was one of them. It was definitely exhibited in 1928 and photographed before that. Why she destroyed it, O'Keeffe did that. That's not out of character for her. If she wasn't satisfied with the way her aesthetic vision was executed, she was very deliberate about how she thought about a picture, the size of the canvas, and then executing it. So maybe she worked it too many times and decided she took it too far, or something of that nature.
And that's so interesting to include that in your talk. For those who are able to visit us here in Santa Fe, we actually have in one of our galleries a canvas that she had destroyed as part of the exhibition. So you can see that was certainly part of the creative process at times, being unhappy with the final product. We have a question here. Will the exhibit be traveling anywhere else besides Atlanta?
It's a 2-stop tour, which is, so make some plans. It's hard for O'Keeffe pictures. It's hard for owners to part with their O'Keeffe pictures for a long time. So we're really happy we have 2 venues for this show.
That is very exciting. And again, we have a copy of the exhibition catalog here in our research library, and it is beautiful. So helps it keep on living beyond the exhibition dates. Another question, and I'm just reading through our chats here, and we just have so many folks, thanking you for your time, saying that your talk was wonderful, that it helps really contextualize this period of Georgia O'Keeffe's life that we may not think of as often when we imagine her most well-known or famously exhibited paintings. Could you talk a little bit about so in your presentation, you also included some other forms of visual information, for instance, advertisements for the hotel and other things that situate O'Keeffe in New York at this period of time. Would you mind talking a little bit about, as a co-curator, how collecting those other sources of evidence helped build a full picture of what this moment meant for Georgia O'Keeffe?
Sure. Trying to understand the phenomenon that was the Shelton Hotel rising in Midtown in 1923, 24 was definitely part of this picture because it really was the catalyst for why O'Keeffe took up the city as subject, getting that view from on high. She'd been in New York since 1918 and didn't take on the city as subject for a number of years. So to try to understand what that building meant at that moment, we looked at architectural journals, advertisements, things of that nature. And we do have some of those in the exhibition to give you a sense. For example, one of the architectural journals, a big folio that we have included, shows a photograph of the Shelton. You just see how high it is. That New York is so much lower around it for a 30-story structure to go up. And now it's not unique. There very quickly, there are other residential hotels going up. There's one just a block away, the Beverly Hotel, which O'Keeffe paints from an elevated view in the Shelton. That's that New York night with the street with lights going up on the upper right-hand side of it. So there's more and more of that kind of activity underway, but to see how the Shelton was advertised and things of that nature, I think just gives a more complete sense of what O'Keeffe and Stieglitz were stepping into, and gives some shape to that lived experience, which is so much a part of this story.
Absolutely, and I think that's also illustrated beautifully by the quotes and the letters and things that you've included too. Just adding that voice to the story makes such a difference. We've had a few questions about photography and maybe the connections between photography and some of the works in the exhibition. Could you talk a little bit about whether in your research or in the exhibition itself, how photography might have been a part of what was happening, as far as was O'Keeffe working from photographs when she painted some of these buildings, or was she inspired by photographs with some of these skyscrapers that have almost lens flare effects with the sun and other light additions? What might be there to explore?
Yeah, there's definitely been scholarly discussions about whether O'Keeffe is directly using the camera or influenced by that in her pictures. I don't think particularly that the Art Institute's painting, The Shelton with Sunspots, is there's some kind of direct correspondence to a photograph. Now, she's living with Stieglitz, so she can have these conversations about what media do and how, or what the cameras and apparatus can do. But I think if we go by O'Keeffe's words many years later, she's connecting it to a viewing experience, which is not necessarily through the lens of a camera, but she would be fluent in those conversations too with Stieglitz near her. I don't think that she's often working from photographs. The one notable exception might be the mural Manhattan that she undertakes in 1932 for an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, which was this project for all the artists who are involved to think through an idea of a mural of the city, and then to triptych, and then to scale up the center panel. And that's what the Manhattan painting was, with those flowers floating on top. And there is a Stieglitz photograph that gives a sense of kind of the way that she flattens those geometries just in one portion of it. And we know she was working on a tight timeline um, for that commission. It's kind of a different project in itself than the way O'Keeffe was normally working. So maybe there was more of an influence of photography there, but it's, it's not a closed question, just trying to think through the possibilities there. But I think O'Keeffe is a painter and is drawing first before she's thinking through cameras.
Absolutely. Thank you for exploring some of those options with us. We might have time for a couple more questions. We have a question from Rachel, who's curious about why Georgia O'Keeffe returned to this subject matter later in life. If you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, for me, I think I do connect it with her 1976 book project which is, whatever we want to call it, it's autobiography. It's a big, richly illustrated book in color, which was, novel. And she is pairing those images of her life's work really with whatever she wanted to say about it as, succinctly, or whatever story she wanted to relate within that. There's not a narrative arc that we're discovering in that book. But it's there that she talks about still seeing city subjects when she's in the city. And so, why did she reprise City Night? It's not exactly the same. Its dimensions are much greater in scale. Is it because she's thinking about her legacy at that moment? And, the New Yorks are part of that. I mean, the New York pictures have a pretty strong position in that 1976 book. The Radiator Building, the Shelton, and many other East River views are there. So they are part of the narrative that she does give us. So maybe she's thinking about that. I don't know. Or something yet to ponder and think about what really is the catalyst for bringing her back for one more exercise in New York.
Excellent. And that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we are right at time, and I often like to close out our conversations with the comment from our chat box, just a reflection from your talk. So I'll share what Rhonda had to say. This is not a question, but just a thank you for sharing. And also from Janice, residing in Illinois, I hope to drive over to the Art Institute and see the exhibition. I so enjoyed the additional information today from Annelise. Thank you so much. And so I would just like to echo those two comments in addition to the many others in our chat. To thank you so much for your presentation today, for sharing about this aspect of Georgia O'Keeffe's life, and to see if you have anything else you'd like to add before we close out.
I'm just grateful for the opportunity to share this work. It's so, you live with this material for so long, this shows up and we're enjoying that, but this is another way to share out these stories. So thank you all for your interest and for your questions. I truly enjoyed it.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you so much, Annalise, for your time and for sharing with us. And thank you to everyone who is here. And we hope to see you at the next Mornings with O'Keeffe program. Okay, thank you again.